Thank you for your interest in our work. This is a presentation of ongoing work with Chris Marcum, who's at the National Institutes of Health, and Molly Copeland, who is at Michigan State University. One of the most well-known network studies of adolescents is the Chains of Affection paper by Bierman et al. And one of their primary aims in this paper was to come up with explanations for why they observed a network structure like the one seen here, which was somewhat unexpected given random graph theory and other expectations of the time. And one of the primary propositions they tested to account for this structure was what they termed four cycles and whether or not these form. And this basically asks the question of, if Bob and Carol are in a relationship at time 1 and Alice and Ted are 2, and both of those break up, and then Carol and Ted subsequently form a relationship at time 2, what's the likelihood that Bob and Alice are likely to enter into a romantic relationship? And what they found was an avoidance of four cycles, or a norm that people avoid dating their ex-partners, current partners, ex-partners. But something that was particularly striking about this finding was that essentially no one could articulate it. In fact, I've taught this article at least 20 times by now, and not once have students stated this norm. However, once you show it to them, they tend to agree that people follow it, but never has it been stated unprompted. However, when I ask students what norms people do follow when forming romantic relationships, they often offer the prohibition that Gretchen Wieners from the movie Mean Girls is suggesting here. Stated more simply, it is the idea that people should avoid dating their friends' exes. And there's an additional point that we think is particularly kind of useful of the question we're testing here that differs from the Four Cycles paper in that it doesn't necessarily require any assumptions of gender or heterosexuality. While both of the examples I've shown on this slide are gendered, our tests need not be. Let's state that proposition more formally and point out that essentially the idea is that if a romantic tie between I and J dissolves, and a friendship tie between I and K exists, then the romantic tie between J and K should not form. And the main thing we want to point out here is that this is inherently a multiplex relationship that involves both friendship and romantic ties to identify that taboo or that prohibition. And necessarily, multiplex questions require multiplex data and methods, which fortunately we have here. But before we dive into that test, we want to point out that the prediction here is actually not that new. The one that I described in the previous slides can directly be mapped onto Mark Granovetter's notion of the forbidden triad as introduced in his classic 1973 paper at this point. And that is that kind of prior romantic tie no longer existing between I and J in our specification, or C and B in his mapping out of the forbidden triad, should suggest an avoidance of this kind of open two-path or two-star type of configuration as he observed, or particularly with respect to the romantic tie between K and J or A and B, we should see it being avoided. But what we started to realize as soon as we mapped out this taboo is that the pattern of avoidance that we are discussing could actually be generated via two very distinct processes. So let's assume at time 1 there is a friendship between I and K, and there's a romantic relationship between I and J. And in all the scenarios we're going to talk about, that I-J romantic tie dissolves between time 1 and time 2. The question becomes, what are the processes that could lead to different patterns that would be consistent with that avoidance pattern of not dating your friend's exes? And what we realize, what we want to kind of specify here is two different processes. So A suggests that the kind of direct mapping onto the prohibition that is described is that if that friendship between I and K persists from time 1 to time 2, once that romantic relationship between I and J dissolves, there should be a prediction of an absence of a romantic tie between J and K. Right? That's the first process that would be consistent with that prediction. An alternative process that would also be consistent with that prediction is that given that I and J's romantic tie dissolves sometime between time 1 and time 2, if instead of there not being a romantic tie between J and K at time 2, there is one, what the pattern of kind of prohibition would suggest is that the I-K friendship should also dissolve by time 2 if that J-K romantic tie is formed. So that initial question leads us to two expectations. The first is the colloquial version that people should avoid dating their friends' exes, and the second is that if people do date their friends' exes, that those friendships will subsequently dissolve. To test these ideas, we're going to use data from what is known as the Prosper study, which many of you have probably heard some about before. To provide just a little bit of background on the Prosper study, it's a longitudinal study that included randomized control trials for interventions regarding substance use prevention that enrolled 2 successive cohorts of 6th graders from 28 different rural communities in Iowa and Pennsylvania, with pretty sizable differences in the number of adolescents in those communities, but all of which were predominantly white. It includes, uniquely, 8 waves of data that were collected via confidential pencil and paper surveys that were administered in school across those 8 waves. The first wave was in fall of the student's 6th grade year. They then followed up in spring of their 6th grade year, and then every spring thereafter through graduation. And beneficially, this study had quite high participation rates both within school and across the waves. So the part of the study that we're going to draw from in particular is its network component, which was separated out into 2 parts. First, they allowed students to nominate up to 7 friendships at each wave of data collection. It's worth noting that one of the Pennsylvania schools refused network participation, so this drops our number of schools down to 27 or 54 cohorts across these schools. And they also asked for the current or most recent romantic partner starting in wave 4 or when the students were in the 8th grade. We subselect from all of those data only waves that include the romantic ties, and we exclude wave 8 because there were some lower response rates there and fewer network nominations in that wave. So we are going to focus on waves 5 through 7. And the reason for wave 5 is we wanted to only use schools that have a single feeder school or are in high school, so there's kind of no transitions of mergers between schools that we're having to deal with that would be problematic for our estimation. And we're going to start with grade 5 to avoid those merges. So as a result, we have 27 communities times 2 cohorts in each, so that's 54 networks, and we have 3 waves of data for each of those 54 networks, including almost 12,000 kids in schools that range substantially in size, but on average are about 200 kids per school. To test our questions, we rely on a relatively recent extension of exponential random graph models that are applicable for multi-layer networks, which is necessary for our questions. This extension of the traditional exponential random graph model differs from the traditional form, particularly in that it allows for the specification of predictions of ties within multiple layers simultaneously and ties that bridge across those layers. Here, those effects are denoted by the L. It's important to point out that while our focal effects here have temporal elements to them, there's no inherently temporal component to the model. So we have to build that temporality into the way we construct the layers of our model. So for example, the first version of the prediction is testing whether or not there is a romantic tie between J and K at some time here, waves 6 and 7, as predicted by the dissolution of the romantic tie between I and J between waves 5 and 6, for example, and the presence of a friendship tie at some previous time point between I and K. Whereas the second prediction focuses on the friendship tie between I and K at some time point here denoted by waves 6 and 7, as predicted by the dissolution of the IJ romantic tie and the presence of a romantic tie between J and K at some previous time point. These predictions include controls for layer-specific edges and gender homophily. Gender homophily is expected to be positive in the friendship layer and negative in the romantic layer, since most romantic ties are heterosexual, though this isn't a constraint, this is a prediction of the model. And additionally, we include the lower-order opportunities or two-star effects that are necessary in order for our triadic closure effects to be observed. So, for example, in order to date my friend's exes, I have to have friends who have exes. And finally, this model is specified as a pooled likelihood model that combines all of the 54 school cohort combinations into one network, essentially with across school and cohort structural zeros, since ties can't form across those layers. I'll just focus on the results from our focal effects. When there is a friend who has an ex, the avoidance of dating that ex is very strong. And when a friend dates my ex, that friendship is also very likely to dissolve. So where does this leave us? Well, with our models having all of the controls behaving more or less as expected, both of the mechanisms for following the taboo are supported. It's worth pointing out that while Prosper is great in a number of ways and allows us to test these questions, it also has the limitation of quite sparse networks, and so it'd probably be useful to test these ideas in other data sets without similar constraints. And we're currently pretty well straining the capabilities of the model, so we can't include other things that we might want to, like homophily on race or SES or similar effects. But the big takeaway here is Gretchen Wieners was right. People do avoid dating their friends' exes, and if our friends do date our exes, then those friendships are likely to dissolve. And so with that, I'll leave things there and take any questions that you might have. Thank you.